Hey there, AP World History students. I am here to finish up Chapter 6, and I'm going to talk a little bit about social culture, social structure, and slavery. So, first of all, in many parts of Africa, there was some defined classes with ruling elites, a merchant class, and a peasant class. But to be honest, much of Africa was not really that structured in a class system, especially when we get into the rural or the less populated areas. So we're going to have through this period, 13th, 14th century, traditional kin-based groups. These mean family-based groups. You're going to be placed in an age grade. So let's say, it's a couple of years span. 3, 4, and 5-year-olds might be expected to set a task, and then they move into the next age grade. And so these are specific, uh, like sort of developmental milestones that you need to achieve before you move on to the next age grade. The land was communal. In other words, I didn't own my piece of land and my neighbor owned their piece of land. It was everybody's land, like we see in this picture below. There was not a lot of private property. People just didn't have a lot of stuff. As far as gender relations go, we're going to see men doing more of the heavier labor, which is really quite typical. And this would include tanning. Tanning is actually really hard work. You have vats of chemicals, and you put the skin and the hair of the skin of an animal, like a horse or a cattle, into a vat, and then that chemical helps to remove the hair, and then the leather needs to be pounded out. So it's very difficult work, as is iron work and other heavy labor. Women, on the other hand, still work in agriculture. In fact, both sexes work in agriculture. We do see more male rule, but this is really important, and I have this highlighted for a reason. Overall, overall, we're going to see many more opportunities for women than in other lands. There are many notable cases of women who held influence in public affairs, who worked as merchants, who even were leaders in military and leaders of military units. So I just would like you to really keep that in mind. While the men do the heavier work than women, you're going to have a lot of opportunities for women. Um, Islamic norms were slow to penetrate African society. So, what does this mean? Well, Islam tends to be a little bit more patriarchal and actually quite, in their dress, quite conservative. Because it is so hot in Africa, many of the Muslim men who came from Southwest Asia to visit parts of Muslim Africa were shocked to see that maybe sometimes the women didn't wear tops because it was so hot that they just didn't. And this was a shocking thing. But part of it was just practicality. Slavery is a really important topic to talk about here. If you look at this picture, you see that the slaves are being held and they're sort of locked into these wooden panels, their hands are. And you can see men at the top who are on camels and they are directing the slaves who are walking. They have like something that looks like spears that they would be prodding them along with. Now, keep in mind, slavery we know has been practiced in Africa since ancient times, including in Egypt. Most slaves are captives of war. So let's say one tribe goes against another tribe, they win the war, so to speak, and they take people as captives. This could be men or women. But someone could also fall into slavery because they were debtors, because they were suspected witches. This might mean that they just had a psychological disorder that came out looking like they were possessed by a demon or something along that line. But then people would also become a slave if they were considered to be criminals. Slaves were principally used in agricultural labor, and slave possession was a status symbol. So if someone were to have a slave in their home, then it would seem as though they had a higher status. Now, something different about slavery in Africa versus maybe what we had in the United States when slavery was legal is that many people could earn freedom after a time period of being in enslavement, and also people enslaved in many African tribes would be sort of welcomed into the tribe as a member of the tribe and eventually even marry into the tribe. Slave trading. This is actually a photo of some slaves that were traded in the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade. This increased in Africa quite a bit in the 9th century. Okay, that's the 800s. Africa replaces Eastern Europe as a principal source of slaves. Initially, slaves were brought across the Mediterranean from the Slavic people. That's where the term slave comes from. But Africa now begins to be the principal source of slavery. This created an internal African slave trade. So, what does this mean? This means that people from the coastal areas are going up the rivers like the Zaire or Congo River, or up rivers in East Africa in order to capture unsuspecting people from their villages. So these more powerful states, both in the West Africa and in the Swahili coast, will attack these smaller kinship-based groups. They will capture the slaves and then they will trade them via the Sahara, or I should also have here the Indian Ocean, about 10 to 20,000 slaves per year. Overall, the Islamic slave trade will last into the 20th century, and about 10 million slaves will be traded in the Islamic slave trade. So there are still people of African descent that live in the Arabian Peninsula because of the Islamic slave trade. Now, there was a notable revolt. The black slaves from the Swahili coast did try to revolt against being sold to Islamic slave traders that were bringing them into Mesopotamian sugar plantations, or other slaves that were being brought to the salt mines. These are both very, very difficult and unpleasant working conditions. The sugar plantations were dangerous conditions because of the way they burned off sugar, and the salt mines were just awful. They were hot, they were dry. In 869, Ali bin Muhammad organized 15,000 slaves. They captured Basra in southern Mesopotamia, which was Muslim. And in 883, the revolt was crushed by the Abbasids, and the Islamic slave trade continued. So that's where we're going to end with this chapter. There's a lot going on in this chapter, so I recommend that you do the reading and the practice questions in the textbook. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.